Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, our distinguished lecturer and professor, as well as a fellow student. So welcome to the coaching clinic, journal paper writing and paper submission to high impact journal. So before we continue, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Muhammad Irgi Ardian. I'm also an undergraduate student in mechanical engineering at ITS. And today I will be guiding you all throughout the session in today's event from start to the finish. So without further ado, let us move on to the main agenda. So as we all know and we all understand, that writing a scholarly paper for publication in international reputable journal is a process that demands dedication, precision, and also guidance from those who have walked the path before us. So therefore, in this occasion, we are very proud to introduce you for our speaker today, Professor Michael Robert Wisnom. He is a professor in aerospace structure who has dedicated decades of the world of research and academics. He is also a fellow of Royal Academy of Engineering, which is a distinction that reflects the international scientific community recognition of his outstanding contribution on this field. So ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome them with a warm round of applause. Mr. Putu Suwarta as our moderator and Professor Michael Robert Wisnom as our speaker for today's event. I will give the mic to Mr. Putu Suwarta for continuing this event today.
Okay, thank you very much, Irgi. And thank you very much for you who has attended this great lecture. And we welcome Michael Wisnom. So he's my supervisor, my PhD supervisor for 4 years, and I learned a lot from him. Also, especially about writing and stuff. Yeah, writing is an expression of ourselves, and how we write is how we express ourselves. And what we publish is hopefully can be useful for other people, and also in terms of scientific knowledge development. And yeah, Michael has the editor of Composites Part A. He has many valuable knowledge that we can learn from. So yeah, today we can learn a lot from him. And yeah, hopefully, and after his presentation, we can do a lot of discussion. So it's not mainly from Michael, but hopefully from you guys, you can ask him about the writing process and the public process, as this is a valuable moment that we can learn from Michael. So hopefully you can be active to ask, and then if you have any question, and or if you have any drafted paper, you can consult with Michael, and then we can have a good discussion. Okay, I will give the spotlight to Michael Wisnom, and please give a good applause to Michael Wisnom.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and tell you something about the publication process. So I'm going to talk quite broadly about the publication process, peer review, as well as about some tips and some things from my own experience about writing papers. So if there are questions as we go along, please just raise your hand. We can have questions going along, but then I hope we'll have more discussion at the end afterwards. So, first of all, a few things that we're going to cover. Why do we want to publish? What's the purpose of publication? I'm going to give some background on scholarly publication, especially from the viewpoint of Elsevier, who's the publisher of the journal which I edit. And then some talk about how we should go about preparing manuscripts, how the review process works, and then some points from my own experience, both as a writer and as an editor. So why do we want to publish? Well, maybe it seems obvious, but we want to make known interesting and important research. Sometimes we also want to comment on other people's research, or to do reviews of what other people have done on a subject. Another reason is to raise our own profile by publishing good work, and people get to know us and what we're doing. And also it's important for the organisation to increase the reputation and credibility of the organisation which you work for. But I'd like to start off just by saying that really it's very important not to view publication as just an end in itself. The real important thing is to focus on quality of research. And a good paper is based on writing up good research. So we should focus on quality. Publication is the end of the process, and it's a means to disseminate novel and exciting and interesting findings, but it shouldn't be an end in itself. These days, I feel there's perhaps too much emphasis on publication. People are judged very much by numbers of papers and citations, and I think it's become a bit too much, actually. And what we should really focus on is carrying out high-quality research. If we do high-quality research, then high-quality papers will be a natural outcome of doing good research. I'd also just like to remind us about an important declaration which was made a few years back, which is called the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, which was an agreement by a lot of people in the field, saying that there's a pressing need to improve the ways in which the output of scientific research is evaluated. Do not use journal-based metrics such as journal impact factors as a surrogate measure of the quality of individual research articles to assess an individual scientist's contribution or in hiring, promotion or funding decisions. So I think a lot of times these days that tends to be forgotten, but I think it's really important. And impact factors are some indication of journals, but they're not the end means to judge a piece of work. And we should really look at the merits of the individual papers and not be too keen to use just simple metrics to evaluate work or individuals. So moving on to a bit of a background about the whole enterprise of scholarly publishing, and show you a few figures and a bit of information from Elsevier. So currently there are about 2,000 publishers in the science, technical and medical arena. And there are about 20,000 peer-reviewed journals and 1.4 million peer-reviewed articles. So these are enormous figures. Of course, that's not all in composites, but there's a huge number of publishers, journals, and articles. So what is the role of the scientific publications? Well, first of all, it acts as a registration of the work, a timestamp to officially note who submitted first, particularly new scientific results. There's an element of certification. The peer review process is very important in ensuring the validity and integrity of the work. Peer review is not perfect. Sometimes things get through peer review which probably shouldn't. Other times, very novel new findings may get difficulty being published. But nevertheless, the peer review process is the best way we have of ensuring the highest quality. Dissemination is the obvious function. The journals provide a medium for disseminating new discoveries and new findings around the world, and also preserving for the long term. So preservation for long term, we can still see articles, you can still find now all online, you can still find articles by Newton, the proceedings of the Royal Society from 1600 and I forget when they started, they are still available online. So it's a long-term record. And that's why major journals are really important, because that one of the things they do is have proper archives. So it's well set up. Elsevier, for example, has a well set up system. So if Elsevier was to go bankrupt, the all the papers are stored in a way, independent way, so that the scientific record can be preserved. So, there's a number of elements to the academic publishing cycle. There's the solicitation and management of the submissions, then there's the whole peer review system, then there's the editing and preparation of the papers ready for publication, the production, and then the publication and dissemination. And Elsevier is involved in all aspects of that work. So these are general statistics, average from Elsevier. So Elsevier reject about 30 to 60% of the papers, and they have about 13,000 editors. So that's a sort of typical average number. In Composites Part A, our reject figure is a lot higher than that. It's about 85% rejection. So we are a top-ranking journal, and we only take the very best papers. So Elsevier has over 500,000 reviewers. So it's a major undertaking. 365,000 articles have been accepted. 12.6 million articles are available. And Elsevier has had over 700 million downloads by more than 11 million researchers in over 120 countries. So it's a very big enterprise. So, looking then at the early process about starting off the publication and the peer review. So the first question is planning paper, and are you ready to publish? This may seem a little bit obvious, but it's still worth mentioning. When are you ready to publish? So if you've got some original results, new methods which significantly enhance what's already been published, then that's a good time to have something to publish. Alternatively, reviews are also always well received, but reviews need to be more than just a summary of what people have done. So I get, as an editor, I get quite a lot of review articles submitted, which are the first chapter of PhDs. PhD students are not usually in a position to write a really good review article, because the review article does require an interpretation of the field, extraction of what the key gaps in the knowledge are, recommendations for where future research is needed. So review articles are special, they're important, they take a lot of time to write, and they really need to be written by experienced people. We do not actually, in Composites Part A, we do not accept review articles without discussion with the editor first. But review articles, nevertheless, are very valuable, and that's another element of publication. Clearly, we don't want to be publishing stuff which has already been published or which duplicates work which other people have done, and also want to discourage incremental work. We get a lot of papers in the Composites Part A related to natural or biocomposites, which are very similar to something that's already been done, but just a slight change of the plant or from which the fibers were extracted. That really isn't very interesting. It might be important in some respects, but what we really want is something which is new. If a particular plant gives a very different response, then that is of interest. But if it's just a tweak and that just what the properties are of a composite with certain different type of fiber, that's not so interesting. So what we want to do is have good quality research which is going to be interesting to other people, and at that point it's worth planning the article. Now we also need to choose the right journal, and that is very much depends on what the audience is for your work. You need to just have one journal. Simultaneous submission to multiple journals is not permitted, and sadly we still get sometimes we get papers which are submitted to multiple journals. This can be checked sometimes. It's checked if submissions to Elsevier are checked, and if the same paper goes to multiple Elsevier journals, it will be flagged up to the editor, in which case both journals will reject the paper. Even if it's in a different publisher, it's curious how often the editors will choose the same reviewers. So sometimes I send a paper to a reviewer and he says, oh, I've just had this paper from another journal. So that's not allowed. I think everybody understands that. I think about the audience. So I mainly publish myself in composites journals. Now, if they're very important new findings, you might want to try to publish in a higher level journal. So we have one paper, which is not mine, but one in the project I'm working on, which has got some really interesting results, and that is being published in Nature. Nature is very, very selective in the papers. So you need to have very, very novel and interesting papers of general interest to publish in a journal like that. But think about who the audience is and look at the scope of the journals. So the journals publish their aims, their scope, look at the types of articles they publish, and use that as a guide. So very often the articles that you're referencing in your paper, that gives an indication of relevant journals where you might want to submit. And also from an editor's point of view, when I see a journal, when I see a paper submitted and I see it's referencing a lot of Composite Part A papers, then it's certainly within the scope of the journal. But if I have a paper submitted and all the papers that are quoted are physics or chemistry papers and no composites papers referenced, then it's an indication that maybe it's not in the right journal, it might not be within scope. So there are a lot of bibliometric indicators. Impact factors, perhaps the most well-known one. But there are also these other ones, eigenfactor, SGR, SNP, H-index, lots of different measures. And the main thing I would say about this is don't worry too much about them. They're an indication of a good journal, but they're not the only indication. And you shouldn't really be publishing in a journal just because it's got a high impact factor if it's not the best journal for your work. So I see some bad practices where people choose the highest impact factor and then they work down the list. When it's rejected from there, they go to the next impact factor and then the next. That's not really a very good way of doing it. So look for what's the most appropriate journal? What is publishing work in your area? What are you referencing in your reference list? Where do you think the readers are going to be? I mean, I guess nowadays the traditional old view of you get a journal, you read it, is rather been superseded by people get alerts and they get their alerts about papers from different sources. But I think there still are. I mean, I personally still get the composites journals topics circulated to me, so I can look through it. So as well as maybe getting alerts from other sources. So make sure you're publishing in a journal which is right for your area. Another point about that is it's usually easier in terms of the peer review. If I get a paper which is a bit marginal in the scope of the journal, I might still take it if it looks interesting, but often it's more difficult to find the reviewers for that, and the publication process may be a bit longer as a result. So, the next phase then, I think one of the most important things is to have a clear message for a paper. So, it's not just about writing up the work you've been doing over the last few months. You want to have a very clear message and one that other people will want to read. And you want to present it clearly in a logical manner so that people understand what you've done. So think about it from the reader's point of view as well as from your point of view of what it is you want to present. So we all want to see good articles. Editors, reviewers, and readers all want well-presented manuscripts and ones which fit within the aims and scopes of of our journals. So it's very important to look at the guide for authors. There's a lot of good information there which will help in the preparation of the paper. And this is the header from the Composite Part A journal. And it'll save time, because if you don't read it, and for example, if you find that there's a page limit, quite a few papers get rejected in Composite Part A. We do have a page limit, and if you submit a paper which is longer, it'll just be rejected straight away, and you'll either have to reformat it, rewrite it, or send it somewhere else. So that's probably one of the most important things that in the author's, in the guide, is about page lengths. But there's a lot of other good information there about how you go about presenting your paper, and whether you present it in as a Word document or LaTeX. These practices depend on the journals, but do be very careful. I just recently had a paper myself, one of my PhD students rejected, and it turned out that there was some very strange comments from the reviewers about the lack of proper formatting of equations and all sorts of very strange comments. But when I looked at the paper myself, I found that it had been submitted as a LaTeX paper, and the PDF converter had messed it up, and the equations got messed up, and unfortunately the student had not checked it adequately after it had been submitted. Usually there is an option, it'll produce a PDF file, and then you can check it, but make sure you do that, because unfortunately sometimes they get messed up. And quite frequently I get papers where the references have been messed up because something's gone wrong with the conversion process from probably a LaTeX file into a PDF. So let's just talk about then the general structure of an article. I think this is fairly straightforward. You obviously have a title, abstract, keywords. So the abstract is a summary of the work. So the abstract should clearly indicate at quite a high level what the paper's about and what was found out. The title is really an abstract of the abstract. And the title is actually quite important because it alerts you to what the key message is in that paper. So try to have a good title which is interesting and encapsulates what it is. And rather than say that the paper is about the effect of one thing on something else, say what the effect is. Increased strength due to X, Y, Z, rather than effect on strength, because you're not actually explaining what the outcome of the paper is. But try to get a good title which will be interesting and appealing, and then a clear abstract. Because from an editor's point of view, and also probably from a reader's point of view, first you look at the title. The title looks interesting, then you'll look at the abstract. If the abstract looks interesting, then you look at the paper. But however interesting the paper is, if you don't have a good title and abstract, readers may not even get to that point, or editors may think this is not very interesting. So then you have an introduction. So the introduction, to me, includes three main things. The introduction should give the background to the work. What is the topic? Why is it important? It should explain what has been done before. And this is very, very important, to explain properly with adequate references what people have done before, not just a list of previous research, but explaining what has been found out, but more importantly, what has not been found out, what is not understood. And then you go on to explain the novelty and the importance of your paper and what the key results are, and introduce how you're going to present the paper. So you need a background, you need a review of the literature, and then a clear explanation of the novelty of your work. So this is where a lot of papers get rejected by me at a desk level, but even before it goes out to review, because sometimes people don't review the literature sufficiently. So the work may be really very good, but if it doesn't explain in the introduction why it's good, then it's not good. And sometimes I can see from the paper that it's novel, it's interesting paper, but they haven't explained it in the introduction. I'll send it back, even if I know that it's good work. In other cases, maybe it's not quite so close to my field, I may not know whether it's good or not. But if it's not explained in the literature review, who's done what before and why this is different and builds on and is better than the previous work, then it will be rejected at that stage and will not actually go out to peer review. So the introduction is very important. The rest of the paper is fairly straightforward: methods, results, and discussion. Think carefully about how to present it. There is flexibility in how you present it, so you don't always have to have all the results, all the methods, all the results, and then just have the discussion. Sometimes you might want to present some of the results and then have a discussion of those results. So, for example, if you have a paper which involves both analysis and experimental work, sometimes it makes sense to have the analysis and discuss the analysis first, or then the experiments and the experimental, before having a discussion about how they compare and correlate. So think about the structure so that it's easily readable and communicates clearly to the reader. Conclusions are very important, and sometimes I get papers with no conclusions at all, which seems surprising, but occasionally that does happen. Conclusions are very important, and conclusions is not the same as just a summary. The conclusions are, what is it that was found out? What are the new elements that have been determined as a result of this work? So it's okay to have perhaps a short summary, but sometimes the conclusions read more like a summary rather than actually what are the conclusions of the work. You need to have acknowledgements, references, and supporting materials. You can have appendices. You can have, these days, you can have a lot of things in supporting materials. You can have Excel spreadsheets, data, other things which can be uploaded as supplementary information to help with to help provide more information, and also if there's a lot of work and you can't get it all in the paper and you think it's still interesting to present that, then it can be put onto some sort of online supplementary data. Actually, there's another form of publication Elsevier has, which is called a data in brief, and that's a separate publication which only has data. So it's not a scientific paper as such, but it's a way of publishing a data set. If you've got some interesting data, you can publish the whole data set as a data in brief, and then maybe there's a scientific paper which discusses the implications of that as a separate publication. Well, I don't think we need to labour this one. Clearly, the manuscript should be well written, clear, objective, accurate, and concise. Use formal language. Don't be too colloquial. Whilst you don't have to be very, very formal. Papers which said very subjective, very personal, I did this and then I did that, don't really go down very well. Obviously more difficult when you're writing in a language which is not your first language. So here I would say do make use of language editing facilities. So these days there are many good programs which will polish the language and help you with your English. But if you use those, do be careful, because sometimes they can change the meaning. So it's difficult. I appreciate it's difficult when you're not writing in your first language. But use those tools and check very carefully that the meaning has not been changed. Because a well-written paper actually is more appealing, and it's very, if you have bad grammar or badly written papers, it creates a bad impression. And it may, even if the work is very good, it's perhaps more likely to be rejected, either by the editor or by the reviewers. So language is important, and you can get help from colleagues, but these days the AI-based tools seem to be very good. I think, I'll maybe mention a bit about AI later, but you have to be very careful, I think, with AI. But for language editing, I think it's very good. And I actually think the standard of papers in the last couple of years seems to have improved. And I think that's because people are using more of these AI tools for the language. I hope only a language, because using the AI tools for other things can be problematic. Getting colleagues to read it. In the past, I would very often suggest people to take their manuscript through either a professional service for reviewing the English, or another colleague who's perhaps a native speaker or has had more experience with a language. That can be good, but these days I think the tools like Grammarly and others I think are pretty good, and probably you can get most of the help of the English with those. So a few points here about authorship. So this is a bit tricky. Who is an author and who is not an author? So authors must have contributed significantly to the work. So the first author is normally the main one who's done the work, who's conducted and supervised the data analysis and presentation, interpretation of the results, and also is the one that's put together and written the first draft and submitted the paper. So that's a traditional first author. Sometimes nowadays with bigger teams involved, there may be several people who've made a really major contribution. Then sometimes it can be a bit hard to decide on the order of the authorship. But in our field, most of the authorship is decided on the contribution to the actual work. So normally PhD students I would expect to be first authors on the paper. In some cultures, it's a bit different. In some cultures, the supervisor expects to be on first. I don't think that's right in our area. I think the first author should be the one who's made the major contribution, perhaps a PhD student or a postdoctoral researcher. And then co-authors must all have made a real contribution to the work. Intellectual contribution, working on the data analysis, contribution to the interpretation, and all co-authors should be reviewing all the drafts of the paper and must be able to stand by the results and approve them and defend the implications. So it's not enough just to be the person who got the funding or who supervised it but wasn't involved, supervised the student but actually wasn't involved at all in that particular piece of work. That's not appropriate. And there's a tendency sometimes these days, in recent years, there's been an increase in the number of authors per paper. And I don't really fully understand that. Part of it is down to bigger teams and interdisciplinary work, but I do suspect that some of this may be down to people adding other authors, because of this issue about people counting papers and submissions and citations. There may be a tendency to want to add other people's authors. I'll add you on my paper if you add me on yours, that sort of thing, which is not good practice at all. So all the authors should have made a scientific contribution to the paper. Same thing if you're doing a project with industry and the industry has sponsored the work but have not been involved at all in the research. They should not be authors. They should be acknowledged in the acknowledgements but should not be authors. And if somebody's just allowed you to use their facilities in the lab, but again have not contributed to the work, that should be an acknowledgement, not as a co-authorship. The other extreme occasionally happens is where people who actually have contributed are left out. That's not a good thing either. So if you've got somebody who's really contributed to the work, has done some experiments, even if it might be just a part of the work, then if they've really contributed to the paper, they should be acknowledged as an author. So, suggesting reviewers. Many journals ask you to suggest reviewers. We used to do this in Composites Part A. It's recently actually been stopped. But many journals still do ask you to suggest reviewers. And these should be appropriate and most importantly, independent experts in the subject. So, it's actually, if you suggest a reviewer who is not working in the field, then that doesn't really doesn't go down very well with the editor. You say, well, why are you suggesting that person? Perhaps it's a friend of yours or something. That doesn't go down well. But if you suggest a reviewer who I know is a real expert in that subject, that's positive, because I can see from that you're willing and keen to have the work scrutinized by another real expert in the field. You should never use people from your own university. I would automatically ignore any reviewers from your own university, and it doesn't look good. If you're suggesting people you know, then are you not willing to put this up for proper scrutiny? I've occasionally had people with the same name as the author, which suspect that there's some sort of family connection, which also is probably not a good thing. So just choose where you can, choose real good independent experts. So in Composites Part A, even though we no longer ask for suggested reviewers, you can still suggest reviewers if you wish in the comments box or in your letter that goes with the paper. Actually, that's one thing I'll say while we're talking about letters. Don't feel obliged to write a long covering letter. The covering letter most journals still require a covering letter, but it's frankly not that important. So don't spend a lot of time writing a long covering letter. Covering letters are most useful if the points you want to make, such as suggesting reviewers, or alternatively, sometimes you may wish to say, I just had a paper yesterday where it said, please don't use reviewers from this university because it's a rival university and we're in competition to develop this field, so please don't use that anybody from that university. So that's fine. So use the cover letter to explain things like that, or if you want to make a brief point about the paper, that's fine, but don't write a very long cover letter because it's not really that important. So a few ethical issues, which I hope everybody's aware of this, but it's still important just to mention these points. What are some of the ethical misconducts that occasionally come up with? Making up research data. Fortunately, that's very rare, but there have been cases where that's been done. Manipulation of existing research data, plagiarism. I think everybody hopefully appreciates these are not good things. Plagiarism is perhaps a little bit more tricky because these days, well, I'll talk about the anti-plagiarism checks later, but these days it's quite easy for editors to see any overlap in papers. So the issue about self-plagiarism has become quite important and perhaps not fully understood. So self-plagiarism may sound a bit of a funny topic, but if you publish the same thing twice, then effectively that is self-plagiarism, because when you submit a paper, you're supposed to be submitting novel results which have not published before. Now sometimes you may wish to have there may be some overlap in what you publish with something you've already published. It shouldn't be too much, but there may be a case where you've done some work before and now you've done something different and new, which is worth independently publishing, but it does rely on or link to previous work. So that should be very clearly indicated in the paper. So the best thing is just to reference the previous publication. But even if you do reference a previous publication, you may want to just summarize what it is, because paper should stand on its own. You shouldn't have to go back and read another paper in order to understand that paper. So you may want to give a brief summary of something that was written in a previous paper, give the full reference, but then provided it is cited, then the editor can see, yes, there's a little bit of overlap, but that's just because it builds on the previous work, it is referenced. But if you include stuff from a previous paper and you don't reference it, then it may look like a copied work or duplicated work, which is not good. So I'll perhaps come back onto that later, because it's quite an important point. So the production of the papers, you have the preprint, which is what the author, that's your initial manuscript which you submit. Then it will go through the review process. Manuscript will be accepted. That'll be your accepted manuscript. And then it will go through copy editing, proofing, and publication, put into the journal format with the logo, the pagination and branding. And then it will go into either into print journal. We still do print journal with Composites Part A. Many journals have stopped doing that now, but some still do print journals which are available in libraries, but mostly, of course, these days it's in PDF files and on online libraries and databases. So, publish and dissemination, and let's come on and talk about some of the publication models. So the traditional model is, which Composites Part A is largely follows, is where you submit your paper, it's published free of charge, and then the institutions or individuals subscribe to the journals and can access the paper. So the readers pay. So the so-called open access publishing, which has got more prominent in recent years, I actually prefer to call it pay to publish, because I think open access is a bit of a misnomer. So the problem with open access, everybody agrees that open access is a good thing, but the question is, who pays for it? And it's become a problem in recent years because there's so much published and the costs of publication are very high, and who is going to pay for that? And there's been a bit of a backlash against some of the big publishers like Elsevier, because people think they're big companies and they're making money out of the publication process, which is true, but they are providing a very good service. So Elsevier has a very good, the Science Direct and the online services and all the long-term archiving I mentioned earlier, that's a really important service, but it costs money and somebody has to pay for it. So universities are increasingly under pressure with their budgets. They can't afford the journals, so that's difficult. And so this open access might seem a way forward. And in the open access model, then the author or the institution funding the work pays for the paper. So it might help in terms of the publication and the finances of it, but I think it's a rather dangerous process because there's an incentive for journals to take work because they're getting money for paying it, for publishing it. So I don't actually think it's a good measure for quality. So it's become very popular in the UK and the EU. There's a requirement from funders that the work must be open access, but I don't think they fully appreciated the implications personally. I think the problem actually is that we've got too much published. I think we should have less papers and higher quality rather than multiple journals and very large numbers of papers, which make the whole enterprise very expensive. Anyway, that's just a personal view from me, but you should be aware of these, and I don't know what the requirements are in this country, whether you have I'd be interested to hear a bit about that, but in many countries there are special arrangements. In the UK, for example, the EPSRC, which is the government funding for universities, they have an agreement with the publishers to allow the papers to be open access, even if they're published by the normal route. So it's quite complicated. It's different with different countries and different funders, become very, very complex. But the basic principle is the traditional journal, you submit and then the institution pays the subscription charge. With the open access, you have to pay an article charge and then it's freely available to everybody. And now there are hybrid journals, and Composites Part A is a hybrid journal. We actually operate in both regimes. So gold open access is where anybody can get it. And if you want to publish in a journal like Composites Part A, you can pay for it to be gold open access, but it's quite expensive. It's about $4,000 for a paper, so it's quite a lot of money. So a lot of people are not able to afford that or don't want to spend the money. So the other alternative is the green open access. And with the green open access, then after the paper's been submitted, then you can put the author-accepted manuscript, not the final Elsevier version of the paper, but the one that you've prepared, which has been accepted. You can put that on an online server, on your institutional database. You can do that after a certain embargo period has been covered. And that's it. Usually, with Elsevier journals, in most countries, it does depend on the journal, but it's typically 2 years. So after that, it's available. And so what happens in the UK is we put our papers on an institutional database, and then if it's blocked, then automatically at the end of that embargo period, it will become available outside the university. But because our funders actually encouraging open access, we're encouraged not to do that, but to actually make sure that we publish somewhere where we have a immediate open access. And there are special funding routes available to us in the UK, and I don't know what the situation is here, I'm afraid. So then there's the archive and promote the use of the papers. And these days, a lot of people are promoting their papers via social media. I'm not in a position to comment on that. I don't do it myself because I'm old school, but I know a lot of colleagues, they put posts on LinkedIn about their papers, and there's many other ways of promoting the paper as well these days, other than just submitting it and publishing it in the journal. So let's talk a bit about the peer review process. What's the purpose of peer review? Well, peer review is actually, it's really about improving the quality of the paper. People generally think about peer review as being acting as a barrier to publishing the work, and of course it is. It's a check on the quality of the work, but also it actually is a very useful way of improving the paper. If you write a good paper, and it goes to good reviewers, you'll often get some useful suggestions which will help and improve the quality of the paper. It's also important to make sure that previous work has been acknowledged and you've properly referenced other work, and you've not just presented something without acknowledging that somebody else has done some of the previous work. And it's a mechanism for really assessing how important the work is, because if it's really not at a good level, then it won't go through the process. But most importantly, it's assessing the originality and the significance of the work. But as well as giving helpful suggestions, reviewers can also sometimes highlight omissions in the reference list, but not just suggest that some of their own papers should be cited. Sometimes reviewers do this. It's not very, very good. Apart from anything else, it alerts you sometimes to who the reviewer is. You get a whole list of papers by one author that they think you should cite, and they're just trying to increase their citations. That's bad practice and goes against the anonymity of the peer review process. So as an author, if you get suggestions to cite certain papers, if you don't think they're relevant, then you can say that in your response to the editor. But sometimes they can be very relevant ones which you do want to cite. But don't feel absolutely obliged to cite papers just because a reviewer has said so. But look at the paper, see, is it relevant? If it is, then maybe you should cite it. But if it's not relevant, then you can just explain to the editor why you're not going to cite it. Peer review is also an opportunity to pick up any problems, ethical problems. I mentioned before that sometimes reviewers have seen the same paper from somewhere else, or be aware of other problems, and they can alert the editor to those. So the process is the author submits the article to the journal, the editor screens the paper, and some will be rejected straight off. And that's usually either papers which are obviously out of scope, which are very poorly presented, or more critically, where the novelty and importance of the work has not been well explained in the introduction. So the editor will not generally will not read the whole paper. I will scan the paper. I'll read very carefully the introduction where it talks about the previous work and what the new paper presents, because that's really crucial. And if that's explained, then it will go through to peer review. But if the novelty is not explained, then it may be rejected at that stage. So it's important not just that the work is good, but you explain and show why it's novel and important. Then it goes out to the reviewers. Typically, we want 2 good reviews in Composites Part A, so it'll probably be sent to more than 2 reviewers, but we look for at least 2 reviews. Of course, if there's a disagreement between the reviews, then we may get a further one to look at that. The editor then looks at the reviews, makes an assessment, and then either, if the problems, rejects it at that stage, or sends it back for revision, and then that process can go through several cycles sometimes until the paper hopefully is finally accepted. So the plagiarism detection software, the Crosscheck, has got a huge database of papers, and it goes through it in great detail, comparing the papers. So similar sort of process which I expect you use also we have the same thing for our students. We check that their work is not copied or duplicated from another student. So it's a very big database with many articles and journals, and we get a report, which I'll show you in a second, which explains any overlaps with other publications. And there's also this COPE, this Committee on Publication Ethics, which has some useful guidelines and training, and also can act as an arbitration if there are any disputes between an author and a journal, if there's some ethical problem. Sadly, we do occasionally get problems like this. I get letters where somebody complains that a student has published his work without his supervisor's name, or the supervisor has published the work without the student's name, or something like that. Sadly, we do get occasionally, not very often I'm glad to say, we do get these problems. Usually they're resolved at journal level, but if there's some difficult case and it goes beyond the journal, then this body is available to advise. So this shows a typical output from a cross-check. I think it's actually probably not a very good example, but what it shows here is every instance where there's a block of words which has been similar in another paper. Now this instance here is one which is pretty normal. So the 17% words, might sound a lot, 17% duplication, but just if you look at the phrases here, you can read them. I don't know whether you can, I can only just about read them here. But it says here, offering the open vessels for migration. I mean, it's just a very short sentence, which is the same. Well, that could be in any paper. So anything like that, I would just ignore. But sometimes it's not like that. Sometimes you get whole paragraphs, which are exactly the same, or with slight modifications. And there, that indicates a problem. Either something, so if I see something like that, it depends how much it is. If it's a very large amount, then I would probably reject it. If it's a smaller amount, and as I was saying earlier, if it's referenced, if the journal, so I see from there where it's been published before. So I may look at that and say, is that publication, is it in the reference list? So if it's in the reference list and it's a small extract from a previous paper that's been published and referenced, then that may be okay. But if it's just wholesale copied from somewhere else, and sadly, occasionally we've had whole papers where the whole paper has just been completely copied and submitted with somebody else's name on. Again, fortunately, very rarely, but it has happened, and that's clearly completely unacceptable. So things are checked carefully at that level. Common mistakes and deficiencies, badly written abstract conclusions, inadequate account of literature. I think that's probably one of the main reasons for rejection. Poor focus, perhaps. Wrong format for paper. We do have short communications as well as full articles, and different journals deal with different types of papers. So with regard to article limits, some papers have quite long composites part A. It's 20 sides of text. Fairly short article limit. I think the response to the reviews is very important, because when you respond to the reviews, then you're doing several things. You want to explain what your view is about the reviewer's comments. Some reviewers' comments are wrong, and you can challenge them. You don't have to agree with the reviewer's comments, but the main thing is not to argue with the reviewers, but to take account of what they said. So if a reviewer has misunderstood something, rather than start arguing with the reviewer, well, this is wrong, well, think, if the reviewer's misunderstood it, maybe it wasn't very clearly written. So try and rephrase it or explain it in more detail. So I don't like it when I get a paper back where the response to reviewers is just to argue with the reviewer and not change the paper. Because that's the whole point of it, is to improve the paper. If the reviewer has misunderstood something, then perhaps it needs to be better explained. So we should have a consistent document with the response to the reviews, explaining where and how the paper's been modified, so that the editor can easily find where it's been changed. There can be confidential comments submitted to the editor as well, but that's perhaps not so important. Example of the type of checklist for reviewers. We don't use this in Composites Part A, but some journals do use this sort of list, which may ask the reviewer some questions about the subject matter and whether it can be shortened or whether the English is satisfactory. We do ask that question, and some sort of rating. That again depends from journal to journal, but just gives you an idea of the sort of question that people may ask. As the rejection without external review, desk rejection by the editor, I've really already talked about that, mainly because of obviously poorly presented papers, or plagiarism check fail, or not explaining what's novel about the work, or it's being clearly out of scope. So articles initially reviewed by at least 2 reviewers. The reviewer receives the abstract, and generally reviews are asked for within 2 to 4 weeks. We currently ask for reviews in 2 weeks in Composites Part A, which is a bit short. We had quite a lot of debate about whether to do that, but it's always difficult. Authors want their papers reviewed quickly. Reviewers want time to review them. My view is that the review process is very important. We want really good reviews, and I don't think it's good to rush reviewers too much. So personally, I would have stuck to 3 weeks, but we had a lot of discussion about that, and last year we reduced it to 2 weeks. And but if you're a reviewer, don't hesitate to ask for more time, because I'd much rather wait for a good review than have one that's done quickly just because there's a deadline. So it's a difficult balance between the reviewers and the authors, but the peer review process is the most important part of guaranteeing the quality of the paper. And then reviews will be chased. If there's a disagreement, we'll get further reviews, and it's really important for the reviews to be anonymous. There's a lot of further information here on I can provide these slides afterwards, but Elsevier got a lot of information online which is available, which is quite helpful. So a few points from my experience. Some of these are perhaps already covered. What is it that makes a good paper? I think a strong message is really crucial. The paper should tell a story. It should be a key point that you're trying to get across to the reader about what's new and what you've done and what's interesting and why it's worth reading. You want to structure it well. You should plan the content before you start to write. And it's really, in fact, some people recommend that you actually plan the content of the paper before you even do the work, because it's very important to think about, if I'm going to do these experiments, what am I going to conclude from them? If they go the way I expect, then will I have enough to write it up as a paper, or will there still be further questions? So it's good to think about the work very early on, and when you're writing a paper, write an outline. What are the main points you're trying to make? What are the results you want to bring in? And you don't have to present it in the way that order you did it. Its chronology can be quite different. You've got to present the work that you've done in such a way as to support the argument you're trying to make. And sometimes less can be more. Don't necessarily include all the results you've got, because it may actually confuse the picture. Just include the key ones which support the message that you're trying to get across. Think very much about who's going to read the paper and how they're going to approach it. Think of it from the point of view of somebody reading the paper and what they want to, what you want them to get out of it, and structure the thing accordingly. I think I've already explained about this. The novelty must be clearly explained in the introduction, with an adequate review of the previous research. How is the current paper different from what you or other people have published before? I think a point about conferences, you have to be very careful, because conferences, many conferences these days are on the databases and will show up on the anti-plagiarism check. So if you put a paper in a conference and then you put a journal paper in afterwards, then the editor may reject it as being no longer novel. So just be very careful. So some conferences, for that reason, have stopped publishing papers. I think conference papers are still valuable, but they should be either initial presentation of results or summary or high-level presentation without all the detail. So, but be very careful not to put too much in a conference paper, because it may give you trouble later with a journal paper. So the work should be complete and self-contained. I don't like papers where we've got part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. Each paper should stand alone. And if there's two papers which are linked, but there's too much work for one paper and you want to write two papers, see how you can structure in such a way. Maybe you have an experimental paper which must stand on its own, and then perhaps there's an analysis and comparison paper which also must stand on its own but could reference experimental paper. So structure it in such a way that each paper is self-contained but can reference other parts. So that may mean a delay. You may need to put one paper in and get it published first before you put the second paper in, because the second paper will have to rely on the first paper as well. I think I've probably covered most of these points. Make sure the figures are clear. Often people will scan papers. They just look at the paper, not read it, just look at the figures. And if you see a figure which just says X against Y, and you don't know what X and Y are, or it's got 3 plots and they're labelled XX1 and XX2, XX3, and you've got no idea what they are, it's not very helpful. So try and make figures stand alone so you can look at the figure and understand it without having to go and bury into the text and understand what it's about. Because people often will flick through, they find something that looks interesting, then that will motivate them to actually read the whole paper. I think I've covered most of the rest of those. Peer review, well, get as much input as possible from colleagues before you submit. Obviously students get their feedback from their supervisors, but other peer review from other colleagues can be very helpful. Be positive about the feedback. If you get negative reviews, it's an opportunity to improve the paper. So view it positively and make sure you do address those points. Don't argue the reviewers, clarify the issues raised, and for each point, make sure the reviewer's comment, your response, and how and where the paper has been modified to address that point are clearly identified. I think I've already covered all of this. Avoid excessive self-citation. If I see a paper and 2/3 of the references are for the author's previous work, it's not very balanced. So if it relies on your previous work, by all means cite your previous work, but don't feel obliged to cite every single paper you've written on the topic. And also make sure, perhaps more importantly, that you also cite other people's work in that topic. AI is being used more and more. It can be a very useful tool, but you need to check very carefully. So I think it's very dangerous to let AI write papers. So sometimes people use it as a tool, but AI is fraught with problems. It can get things wrong, it can fabricate and have hallucinations, and so I think it's very dangerous. I think it's a useful tool for polishing English, perhaps for doing certain elements of formatting. It can be useful for that, but I don't think it's a good thing to use AI for really important aspects of the paper. And whenever you do use AI, just make sure you really carefully check what it's done, because it may have polished the English, but it may have actually changed the meaning. So there are a couple of papers which I can provide about writing a paper. This Whiteside's group is quite a good one, and he really focuses on some of the key aspects of having a clear summary. So he says, or not a summary, but an outline. He recommends to start writing the possible outlines of the papers early on in a project, even before you've done all the work, and really organize the outline around the data, the tables. Think about what you want to put into that outline, and only when you've got a clear outline, the clear message, then you write it. If you start writing the paper immediately, then sometimes you'll finish the paper and it won't really communicate very clearly. But if you've got a good outline and you know exactly what you want to present and why, then it'll help you produce a really good paper. So that finishes. I've taken a bit longer than I expected, but hopefully that was interesting, and we can move on to questions and discussion or anything else you want to do.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael, for the really insightful presentation. So yeah, you can give a big applause. Yeah, hopefully it will give you some insight into writing scientific papers and the process until the papers has been published. So yeah, we welcome any question and discussion with Michael.
Okay, so thank you so much for Mr. Putu and Professor Wisnom for the incredibly insightful presentation. We are sure that all the audience here has gained a lot of new knowledge or even a new perspective about paper research publication. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's give one more round of applause for Mr. Putu and Professor Wisnom. Okay, so let's move on to our next agenda about today's event, which is the question and answer session. So this Q&A session will be held for 30 minutes, and we will pick 3 of the first audience to ask their question or even discuss and consult about their paper writing. And Professor Wisnom will answer one by one. So the audience who have questions or you want to consult and discuss about your paper, please raise your hand. Okay, we have 3 audience.
We need a microphone. I don't know whether I can hear.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. And I would ask about as AI tools become heavily integrated into our writing process, I would like to ask for your perspective on its ethical boundaries. From a publishing standpoint, how much AI involvement is permissible, and what specific details should author disclose in the acknowledgement session regarding to the use of such tools, AI tools?
Yeah, so this is a very topical comment. I think I partly addressed it already. I think AI is only a tool. I think sometimes people think it's something magical, and it's just a tool, and it needs to be used very carefully like any other tool. So it is important to acknowledge where you've used AI. If there is a statement required, actually I should have probably looked that up, because there is there is a statement on the submission process about AI. So AI, well, let's do the first thing first. AI cannot be an author. So in the early days of AI, there were a few cases where AI was named as an author on the paper. So current AI cannot be an author. And the reason for that is because an AI cannot stand behind and substantiate and defend the work. So it's really important that the authors are the ones that say, yes, this is what we did, this is what we found, we stand by this, and we're prepared to defend it if other people disagree. So that's really important. So I think, personally, I think AI is best used for the relatively straightforward parts, such as English editing, formatting, possibly rearranging some text and helping with the writing style. But there you've got to be very careful that it actually does it properly. I don't think it's a good idea to use AI for, let's say, ask AI to write the introduction. So AI can do a literature survey, but it's not necessarily a very good one. And I don't think at the moment that AI is in a position to be able to do that properly, because it has to, AI can certainly produce a list of papers and what they said, but the important point is, how does that all relate to what you've done? And I think that the person who's done the work is in the position to be able to make that judgment. So I think AI is a tool. I think it should be used not too much. I think there's a tendency these days for students to use it too much, and I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think it encourages them to think and reason things through for themselves. And I'm possibly old school, but I do think that we have to be very careful with the use of AI. So I had a student recently told me, yeah, when he gets a paper, he just sticks it into ChatGPT and asks ChatGPT for what are the 3 main points in this paper. So that's a totally useless exercise. You'll learn absolutely nothing from that. You may get a nice summary from ChatGPT, but it won't be very useful. And it's the same thing with writing. You ask AI to write something, it may produce something which reads nicely, but is it actually relevant to the paper? So personally, I may be conservative, but I would say that AI should be used very sparingly in writing papers. I'd be very interested to hear if somebody disagrees with that, because it's a very, very hot topic at the moment about what AI can and can't, or should and shouldn't do. And we had this debate in the university about student work. To what extent can students use AI in their work? Because it's a tool. We don't want to tell students, no, you can't use AI, because it's a useful tool. People are using it everywhere. What we need to do is to train them to use it properly, to be aware of its limitations, to watch out for its problems and its hallucinations, but to use it as a good tool. So that's my view.
Okay, thank you for Professor Wisnom for the answer. We will move on into the next question. For the
Thank you very much, Professor Michael, for your insightful presentation. Publication in high-quality journal is our dream, actually, as a student. But when we try to make a submission, we often receive a rejection. I have 3 questions about it. First is, how do we determine the novelty of our articles is sufficient to merit publication in high-quality journal? The second, for a review article, how do you formulate new research finding or research contribution that are worthy for publication in high-quality journal? And the last one is, what should be included in the conclusion so that is different from the abstract which already has a structured framework? Thank you very much.
Okay, so novelty, I'm not quite sure. How can you determine if it's sufficiently, the novelty is sufficient? Is that what you're asking about?
Yes, how we determine the novelty for our article is sufficient to merit publication in a high quality journal. Because sometimes when we think that our novelty is enough, but when we submit to the journal, that we receive a rejection that our novelty is not good enough.
Well, I think it's quite difficult to say specifically there, but I think it comes back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of the literary review, identifying clearly what people have done before, and then why your work is different from what other people have done, and then why that's important. Why should anybody care? Going back to the example I mentioned before, if you have something on a natural fibre composite, and all that's happened is you've chosen a different fibre, well, many journals will not regard that as sufficient. But the actual level, that will depend somewhat on the editor, so it's a bit hard to say. I'd be happy to look at one or two papers if there's any interest while I'm here. I'm here for a week, and I'm quite happy to have a look at some specific cases and try and make my judgment as how I would look at it. But I think it's a bit difficult to argue, and of course different journals have different levels. So Composites Part A, I think we have quite a high standard, but other journals it may be easier. But I think you should know yourself from the work, if you've done a good review of what other people have done, you should be able to articulate why it's different and why it's important. And a lot of it is down to how clearly you express that in the paper. So it may be that the work is novel, but you haven't actually done a good enough job of explaining the novelty so that the editor appreciates it and determines it's worth sending to peer review. So I don't know whether I really answered the question, but that's a few thoughts. So the second one was with regard to, were you talking about review papers?
Yes, about the research contribution in the review article. How can we formulate new research finding or research contribution so the review article is worthy for publication in a high quality journal?
Yeah, so that is, I think that's quite difficult, and as I mentioned, I think review articles are hard to write. So review articles require somebody with good experience in the field who can not just read and summarize what's been done, but can extract what's important about that, analyze the gaps, and really point the way to what needs to be done. So trying to make a synthesis of the current research, not just summarizing it, but explaining it, and particularly the gaps and what the implications are, and where new research is needed. So I think review articles, I wouldn't push them as being because they take a lot of time to write good ones, and they are quite difficult. As I mentioned, we would like to, if somebody wants to write a review article for Composites Part A, we want a discussion between the editors about what it's about, and is it novel? I mean, there are a lot of review articles out there, and if there have been recent reviews along a similar topic, then why would we want another one? Of course, in some areas, things are moving quite fast, and we may need to update the review articles. But still, we want to identify what are the research gaps and what are the things which really need to be done. So just reviewing the literature is not enough. It needs to add something to it in terms of some analysis, some interpretation, or some... So I'm actually writing a review article myself at the moment. It's a bit of a hybrid article. It's a sort of review. So I'm writing a review about compressive failure. We've had a big project on compressive failure of composites, and so I'm taking a lot of work which was done before, including some work I did 30 years ago, but I'm comparing the different mechanisms by which compression occurs in a composite. So there are actually 3 different levels at which you get compressive failure. And you get compressive failure due to overall structural instability. So at the macroscopic level, you get compressive failure because of material instability, the material level, but also you can get compressive failure within individual fibers at the microscopic fiber level because of the structure of the graphite within the fibers. So you've got these three different levels. So I talk about these three different levels and refer to what. But then the novel bit I'm bringing to this is linking these, explaining the difference, and showing how these different modes can interact. So I think that's quite an interesting example of something where part of it is review, but it's more than just a review because it's actually suggesting something new which hasn't really been realized in all the papers that have been written before. So I don't know whether that's helpful, but that's a few thoughts about review. And the third point then?
Okay, the last one is what should be included in the conclusion so that it is different with the abstract, where the abstract is already has a structured framework.
So the abstract is abstract of both what's been done and what's been concluded. So the abstract, the conclusions, so I think it's a very good question because there's a lot of overlap, and I think often there's a lot of repetition between abstract and conclusions. So in my view, the abstract should say a little bit more about what's been done. So the abstract is a summary of what's been done, but it should also mention what's been concluded. So I don't like, sometimes abstracts don't refer to the conclusions. They should. So abstract should be brief outline of what's been done and the main thing that has been found out, not the details. So the conclusion is much more detailed about the specific things that have been found out, but will be longer than that and have more detail, and the conclusions should not have a long summary section at the beginning summarizing everything that's been done. I think that's unnecessary. A lot of papers have what's more like a summary at the beginning of the conclusions, which I don't think is necessary. I think the conclusion should focus on what's been found out, what's new, what's been concluded in more detail, and then a very brief summary of that should go in the abstract.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Michael.
Okay, so we will move to the next question.
Yeah, good.
Thank you, Professor Wisnom, for the presentation. I have a question to ask. In publishing high quartile journals, when we submit the paper, we are happy when we receive the reviewer's comment about the paper instead of a rejection. But after receiving the comment with a near deadline to revise, are there any tips to assure the paper's quality while rushing the deadline? Thank you.
I'm not sure I quite understood the question. So you're talking about the deadline for responding to the reviewer's question, reviewer's comments?
I meant by sometimes when we publish the paper, we got the reviewer's comment. And then we have to revise based upon the reviewer's comment with a near deadline.
Yeah. So I think this is something I actually don't agree with the journal policy. I think the deadlines are rather short, and it's all part of the process. Journals want to show that they're very fast in publishing, and so there's a bit of a trade-off between the journal quality. So I would say don't hesitate to ask the editor for more time. So I actually get rather a lot of emails like that, which to me is a bit of a nuisance because the journal pushes a bit too hard to get things back quickly. So personally, I think quality is more important than speed. But when you look at metrics, then speed is one which people look at. And so my main point is focus on the quality, do the the revision properly. If you need more time, write to the editor and say, I need more time.
All right, thank you for the answer, Professor Wisnom.
All right, so we move to the next question, which is the last question.
Okay, thank you for the presentation and for taking the time to answer my question. I really enjoyed hearing your perspective about this topic. So for my question is, what level of contribution is enough for someone to be considered as the co-author in research paper? For example, if the person helps create the program or make the diagrams used in the research paper, can they be included as the co-author? Thank you.
So this is quite a difficult boundary, what is enough. I think creating figures is not enough. Creating figures is not contributing to the research unless there's something special about the figures or some new innovation, but generally speaking, figures is not enough. So a technician, for example, who helps with the work in the lab generally should be acknowledged, but unless they've been actually involved in the detail of the work, they're probably not a co-author. So usually in our work, I would not put technicians, if they've just helped with running the machine or doing the tests, they would not be a co-author. If they've actually actively participated in designing the fixture or in some way contributing to the experiment or to the analysis of the results, then yes, they should be an author. So it's tricky, but they should have made an intellectual contribution to the paper and to be able to stand by that paper as an author. If they've just made a fairly small contribution to the paper, then it should probably be just put as an acknowledgement. Is that helpful? If you've got any specific examples you want to talk about, we could consider it.
Okay, maybe some specific example. What about the person who make the program to take the data set for the paper, for the processing the data, like taking the picture in a form of PNG or using real sense, but using that program to create the processing data more simpler. Is that counted as the co-author or perhaps not?
So I suppose it depends how important that process is to the paper. If there's something important and novel about the way that's been done, but if it's just you've told somebody, please write that program to do this, that, and the other, and they've written it and you've used it, then I would say no. So yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so as the clock has shown that our Q&A sessions will come to an end. But before we end, Mr. Putu will like to give all the attendees a couple of words.
Okay, thank you very much for all of the questions. I'm sure that you are so eager to write a good paper and publish in a high impact journal paper. So, yeah, maybe for I would like to ask also, and also to encourage all of the students and asking from my perspective. So, what makes you so eager and so excited to write a research paper from all these years. I know that you have published from 1990 up until 20 this year. I mean, what makes you so excited, and what makes you keep going to write a good paper? So this is to encourage students, also encourage myself to continue writing and publishing, so we can contribute to the science, the development on science and technology. Thank you, man.
So I think it's the research to me is exciting. So I'll go back to this compression paper. I've been interested in compression for many years. I did some early work in compression 30 years ago, and I still think it's really interesting because we have not fully understood what controls compressive failure. Even after all these years, all this work, we've still not really understood fully what controls the compression. So I've got some new results. I think it's really exciting. I'm excited about the fact that, for example, that we found kink bands in individual carbon fibers. So kink bands are normally thought about as a failure mechanism in a material, but actually we see these kink bands within a single carbon fiber. It's a fantastic result. So I'm really motivated by the work. I think the results are really interesting, and therefore I'm keen to communicate it. I'm not writing papers because I want to add one more to my CV. I don't need the papers now, and or even when I was younger, that wasn't really a motivating factor. I just think that the work is really interesting. If it wasn't interesting, I wouldn't be doing it. I used to work in industry. For many years I worked as a consultant, and the work was highly paid and was interesting in one level, but I wasn't actually able to get to the fundamentals of what controls failure. I just had to write a report and get on to the next project. So I was really interested to get involved in research. So I took quite a large pay cut to go to the university and undertake research, and I found it very satisfying, very interesting. Not only the research, but also working with students and helping them to develop. So it's the motivation for me is just the interest for the work. And I'm really excited about this compression work that we've been doing, and I want to communicate it to other people so that other people can see the interesting things that I've seen. So I don't know whether that...
Okay, thank you very much. I hope it will encourage us to continue doing new research that can contribute to the field of science and technology. Also, one more thing about, you mentioned about it's better to have a good quality paper being published. So and nowadays, for early researchers, we also need the amount of paper and the quality of paper needed to be published in such a way that we can get promoted. So how to balance and how to find a balance in that way? We also need to publish a lot of paper, maybe two papers in 1 year in a high index quality impact factor, but it needed to be also good quality paper. Is collaboration one that can between university is one way that we can publish a good quality paper, or do you have any other perspective?
Well, I think collaboration can be very helpful for many reasons. It's very good to collaborate. It's interesting to get other people's perspective. You collaborate, you can get different approaches you can apply. So I think collaboration is definitely very, very good, very strongly encourage it. We like to do it, and it's very important. But I don't think you should collaborate just with the aim of being able to produce more papers. I mean, that may be a result of it, but I think it's all about not thinking about the end. Going back to the question about promotions, I think really the problem is, and it's a difficult one to address, but I think as institutions, as universities, and as we should not be placing so much emphasis on the papers. Going back to that San Francisco Declaration, I think it's a bit unfortunate that in many cases now there is too much emphasis placed on that. So from the point of view of the university, we should be looking for quality. I appreciate it's very difficult for a young researcher who is faced with the current situation, which is there is too much emphasis placed on numbers. It's very difficult for somebody in that position to resist the pressure to publish more. But I think it's a balance. I think when I look at students and people that we employ, I would rather see some really good papers rather than just large number. So I think there's a balance. I appreciate that these days people do look often for publication lists, but I think temper that with the importance of writing good papers, because I think in the long term, good papers will be better than lots of shorter, not so good papers. So rather than slicing it up into the smallest publishable unit and publishing lots of papers, try to write good ones, and I think in the long term that will be a good policy. But I appreciate it's really quite difficult, and I think that more senior people in the universities and involved in promotions and hiring decisions need to try to resist that urge and try to look a bit more closely at what is being published.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I think the last one, when you consider good quality paper in the end, and it will contribute to the development of science and technology and new knowledge, does it also include that it will be taken by the industry and being leveled up to a higher JRL level? Is there any case of a good paper being used by the industry and then being applied? Although I know that it will take many years for that.
Well, that's a tricky question, because sadly industry don't often read papers, in my experience, which is a great pity, but that's true. So in my research, what I aspire to do is do interesting research which is also important. So when we're working with companies, I don't like to do a project which is just cranking the handle and doing some results. I'd like to try and do something which is novel and which hopefully can be published as well, whilst recognizing that for the company, it's probably not going to be the paper that's going to result in the application. So I think there is a different process and a different skill in getting work to be adopted by industry. And if you want to get things adopted by industry, the best way is not to publish papers. So this does cause some tensions in the university. We have people in the university who are working closely with industry, and as a result of that, maybe they don't get so many published peer-reviewed papers because they spend their time doing things which are important in industry. And I think in engineering, it's very important that we work with industry and with applications. And so viewing it purely from the point, I think there's been a tendency in engineering, certainly in the UK, that engineering is viewed in a similar way as science, in that published papers are the most important thing. Whereas actually, impact and industrial application are also important. And in the UK, we have a research assessment exercise every so many years, which the government is assessing the work of universities. And going back a while, it was quite heavily based on publication and metrics and citations and other scientific measures, perhaps scientific measures, but now there's a strong emphasis put on impact. So we have to, as well as in the current research excellence framework exercise which is going on at the moment, I've had to write a short summary of my 3 best papers in the last 5 years, and I have to say why those papers are, why they're good, why they're novel, why they're important, and what the significance is. So that's part of the exercise. So it's not just saying how many citations they've got, it's saying why are the papers important, why are they original, why do they matter? So that's part of it. But we also have to do impact case studies. So in the last exercise, which was a few years back now, from our university, we had 2 impact case studies which were based on our work in composites. One was related to Rolls-Royce, the fact that we developed methods which Rolls-Royce had adopted and used in the design of their engines. Now, we did get papers in that work, but it wasn't the papers that gave rise to the impact. What gave rise to the impact is us working with the Rolls-Royce engineers to implement the methods we developed in their internal systems help them to use them on their applications and persuade them and demonstrate to them that they were useful. And then the second case study was with regard to a startup company, which one of my PhD students started, where he'd used the work that he'd done his PhD, which in his case actually did not result in many publications, which it probably should have done because he did some very good research. But he then went on to start a company, and that company applied the work that he'd done in his PhD to many large companies, to products. He was doing consulting for companies all around the world, applying what he'd developed in his university career to practical industrial problems. So that's real impact, and that's important, and engineering should be assessed on impact as well as novel scientific contributions. And my goal in doing research with companies is to try to do both. It's quite difficult, but I don't want to just do purely academic papers which researchers will read, which will never have an impact on industry, but also I don't want to do industrial work which is never going to result in new scientific developments. That's what I largely did when I worked as a consultant before. I was working very much on the applications. It was very interesting, but I wasn't able to actually advance the frontiers. So I try to get in a situation where we can do both. And it's a tricky balance, but it can be done.
Thank you very much, Michael. So to summarize all, it's not only writing papers, good papers, but the novel research that we are doing, the curiosity that we are doing in conducting this research that can contribute for new science and technology, and also knowledge that can have a huge impact to humanity and also company, industry, and to the environment also. I think that's also important. And from there we can also publish a really good high quality paper that we can conclude for today's speech from Professor Michael Wisnom. So yeah, thank you very much for all of you who has come here, and please give a big applause to Professor Michael Wisnom.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Putu and Professor Wisnom, for the very insightful and enriching answer, and also the new. Yeah. So before we formally close today's event, we would like to invite all the attendees to take a picture with Professor Wisnom and Mr. Putu to capture and memorize our event for today. For our documentation team, we kindly ask you to guide everyone into position.
Yes. It's about that. Research, because writing paper will take also before writing the paper we need to do some good research. So that's